This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Plato. Do you ever wonder what happens if you donate your brain to science? Well, it can be used to help researchers better understand and treat all types of diseases and disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism, traumatic brain injuries, and depression. But researchers also need to study the brains of people unaffected by any type of disease to help us better understand what scientists can learn from studying human brains and how to donate your brain to science after you're gone are my guests, Dr. Bill Scott, Executive Director of the University of Miami. Dr. Bill Scott, Executive Director of the University of Miami's Brain Endowment Bank based in Miami, and Tish Hevel, CEO of the Brain Donor Project based in Naples, Florida. Welcome to Science Friday.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Nice to have you. Nice to see that you guys are in nice, warm Florida. We're up here in the Northeast.
We are.
Pretty chilly, but yeah. Well, let me go right to the questions. Dr. Scott, so there's a clear need for people who have rare brain disease or neurodegenerative disorders or mental health diagnoses. We understand there's a need for them to donate their brains to science. But what about if you don't have any specific brain disorder? Can our brains still help?
Absolutely. And in fact, we need people of all kinds to donate their brains for scientific research, because every time we want to understand what's going on with a particular disease or condition, we have to have brains to compare it to. So if I want to understand why some people with Alzheimer's disease have certain types of symptoms, I can compare them to other people with Alzheimer's disease, and that tells me something. But what I really want to know is what's very, very different between somebody that doesn't have Alzheimer's disease, what protects them from developing Alzheimer's disease, and what makes somebody else more likely to develop it. And you can use any condition that involves the brain in that example. And we always need a comparison group. And so anyone, regardless of what your brain is like, can donate your brain for research, and it would be useful.
Now, I understand you actually need, maybe twice as many neurotypical brains to serve as controls in all sorts of studies. Is that right?
Right. So every study is different and has a different definition of that comparison group that they want to put together. So in order to make sure that we have enough comparisons for all the different studies that are using different types of brains for different types of conditions, a comparison group for an Alzheimer's study might be people that are of a similar age to people that get Alzheimer's disease. But if we're studying depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, we'll need people with different backgrounds, different experiences, and different ages to donate their brains as a comparison. So it's not just one group of people. We need representatives from all ages, both sexes, all genders, all racial and ethnic groups to consider participating in research so that the benefit of the research will accrue to all members of our society.
And so I guess you would need more people with quote unquote normal brains to sign up, because maybe they think they have a normal brain when they pass away, but when you look at their brain, it may be abnormal. So you need a bigger pool of brains.
That's right. And then the other thing is that when you sign up, it may take quite a long time for you to be done using your brain. And so you sign up as a normal control, and by the time you're finished with your brain at the end, you have developed a condition that makes you one of our cases instead of one of the comparisons. So that happens frequently. And sometimes what we find is that people that live a very, very long life, they might wind up with changes in their brains, which would make them less likely to be a comparison for somebody with Alzheimer's or somebody with Parkinson's disease, but they themselves don't have the disease. So we have to cull through a lot of those individuals, a lot of those donors, in order to get exactly the right group of people to compare to the people that have the diseases.
All right, we've been talking about 5 minutes about brains. Tish, I understand you actually have brought a human brain with
I
you this
have.
evening.
I have. And this is an interesting one for a few reasons. I'm being very careful. This is the brain of a man who died when he was 101 years old. And he was said to be very astute right up until the time he died. I'm also told by the scientists that his brain is larger than what is typical for a man his age. So yeah, this is his brain, which is, I feel so reverent about this because the tissue is so precious. But we did want to show you.
Do we
If I
know
can add
what?
on to what
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to make a point about what Bill was talking about neurotypical or control brains. One of the reasons we need them so badly is there's a huge study going on where they are literally atlasing all of the cells of the brain. And so the need for neurotypical brains is going to be significant, really significant. My big concern as the communicator and outreach person is many of those people will die unexpectedly. If they're controls, obviously they don't have a neurologic disorder. And so my biggest fear is the first time a lot of people will learn about brain donation could be when they're asked to consent to donating a loved one's brain. And that's so traumatic as to be cruel. That's why I'm so glad we're doing this show, because we need to get the word out to so many people how important this is.
Let me ask you, dive into that a bit deeper because a lot of people, and in some states on driver's licenses will say, this is an organ donor. Is the brain part of the organ donor program?
No.
Yeah, it is not part of an organ donor program where people are consented to donate organs to transplant. We don't transplant brains. And it doesn't automatically mean that somebody who's registered with one of those programs will be asked if they want to donate their brains for research purposes. Some states will, and other states will not. Now, sometimes what will happen is somebody will be asked at the moment that someone has died and it's noted that they're an organ donor. If they're unable to donate their organs for one reason or another, they may be asked, well, do you want to participate in a research project or donate tissue for transplant? And then we will wind up getting a referral from that organ donor agency saying, here's somebody that you might want to talk to. But it doesn't happen as often as we'd like. And as Tish said, we would really like for people to be considering this ahead of time so that you can have that conversation with your loved ones and indicate that your desire is to donate your brain in addition to donating your organs for transplant, because you can sometimes do that. And sometimes making those wishes known will allow you to donate something if you cannot donate your organs.
Actually, Ira, there are 5 big myths or misconceptions that I face all the time. And the first one is, hey, I'm an organ donor. I checked the box. I'm a brain donor too then, right? It counts. No, separate arrangements need to be made. As Bill said, it's not automatic. In fact, it's very rare. I think your brain bank is one of the exceptions that works so closely with the organ procurement organization. So the other one is people who've signed up to be an anatomical body donor, usually to a local medical school. Yes, they're getting your brain, but no, they're not using it for neuroscience research. And scientists all agree that the brain is so much more valuable for neuroscience research than it is for anatomic study. There's also some people think we don't need controls. I don't have a disease. They don't want my brain. You know how wrong that is. People are concerned also that it's disfiguring, and it isn't. The brain is removed through the back of the head, so an open casket is still very much an option. And then the final thing is there an additional cost? And you'll all be pleased to know that there is not when you donate through one of the NIH brain banks. The NIH knows this is the most precious tissue for neuroscience research. And so they reimburse people along the way to be able to acquire it.
Well, what do I do if I'm listening to this program now and you have motivated me to donate my brain? What's the ABC? What are the steps, Dr. Scott or Tish, to go ahead with this?
Well, Bill, do you mind if I jump in since we sort of...
Yeah, I think this is a good one for you.
So we sort of function as the intake arm for the Neurobiobank, which is the structure of the NIH's brain banks. So we we send everybody to our website, which is at braindonorproject.org. You can learn more about brain donation, about the process, how badly they're needed. And when you're ready, there's a little brain pre-registration button in the upper right-hand corner. That will take you to a very brief online form. First question is, are you doing this for yourself or someone else? Second question is something to the effect of, are we in a hurry? And the remainder is just contact information, and then there's room for a diagnosis at the end. Once you hit submit, we're able then to make a decision about which of those brain banks makes the most sense for that person and connect that person or his or her family to the brain bank. So at that point, we sort of hand off the relationship to the brain bank, and then they proceed with the second set of registration forms, talking to the family and letting them know what to expect at time of death.
Very, very good. I think that was well spoken. I think a lot of people would like to know that. Now, Dr. Scott, let's walk through the ABCs of what happens to the brains. I know that the brain bank you run at the University of Miami is part of a network of brain banks across the country, right? Run by the NIH, called the Neurobiobank.
Yes.
Tell me about the network, the brain banks. What happens when a brain gets to a bank? It makes a deposit, so to speak.
So one of the things that I like to say is that the Brain Endowment Bank at the University of Miami specifically chose to have that endowment in the middle of our name because it's like the endowment of a university, where you're making a gift for a resource that will fund or enable work that we do with these brains long into the future. So it's a bequest that we're receiving. And so once we get the notice that somebody wants to donate their brain, we organize the effort to coordinate the recovery of the brain at the time of death. This can take place anywhere in the country where we have a network of pathologists and technicians that work to do this work. The brain then gets put on ice and sent to the closest bank. So that's one of the reasons why we have this network, so that we can have something that is a little closer to most donors. And then when it arrives, we will take it and we will dissect it so that it can be used for many different projects. So we'll divide the brain in half. We'll put one half of it into a fixative, which most of you would know as formaldehyde. We call it formalin most of the time. And that preserves it so that we can look at the structure of the tissue. And then we take the other part of the brain and we will slice it across like you would any kind of sliced, I'm going to say that again. We will slice the hemisphere, the half of the brain, so that we then have smaller sections that can be frozen. And that preserves the brain in a way that it can be used in different kinds of experiments from the fixed part. So we can use that to look at proteins and DNA and RNA and the different structures within the brain to see how cells change. And those get stored in different places. The fixed tissue goes into a container that stays in a cool room like a refrigerator. And the frozen tissue goes into a very low temperature freezer that in Miami is in a building that is hardened against hurricanes and has its own backup power systems, so that in the event that something were to happen outside, the brains inside would stay cool and safe. And every brain bank has a slight variation on this, but we all basically have the same structure, a place where we can receive the brain and dissect it, and places where we can store it so that we can then pull it out and share it with investigators when they need it.
How does an investigator make a withdrawal? Sorry about that. From your, you've heard of these jokes, I'm sure, too many of them.
Right.
From the bank. I mean, do they come to you with a project and you okay it? I mean, how does that system work?
Most brain banks use a similar system, and the Neurobiobank is no different. There is a web-based portal where investigators can go and make a request. They describe the study they want to do. They tell us what they would do with the tissue and how much they need. They have to justify the different ones that they select and how many. And then it goes through a review process to make sure that, yes, the science actually would benefit from the use of this resource. It's a limited resource, so we make sure that the tissue is being used scientifically appropriately. And then as long as those criteria are met, a recipient or a requesting scientist can be sent those samples for use in their lab, and the NIH supports that. Other brain banks that exist under other models have other ways of requesting tissue. Sometimes the samples are only made available if you're working on a certain type of project, or you're at a certain institution or part of a bigger network. So the NeuroBiobank was established to try to widely distribute tissue, but some brain banks also exist that have much smaller collections that they then share on a smaller basis.
Tish, how did you get involved in this? I mean, it doesn't seem like something you wake up one day and say, you know, I'm going to start a brain bank, or I'm going to collect people's brains.
Right. I think I'll be a brain guy.
It's
My
not brain
dad was
science.
sick. My dad had dementia. Well, it sort of is. My dad had dementia, and he was at the point where he was diagnosed with suspected Lewy bodies dementia. We weren't familiar. So in our Googling and trying to research what that was about, we came across the idea of brain donation online because, you know, researchers thought they were onto something at that point and they needed it. So we made arrangements to donate my dad's brain, and it was very, very complicated at the time. In those days, the NeuroBiobank was brand new, really, so they just hadn't had a chance to do all this yet. And now it's so seamless. You know, for the scientists, they go to that website, the neurobiobank.nih.gov, and it's like, you know, oh, you want to be a brain donor? That's great. We need you really badly. And it links to the Brain Donor Project to start the thing. But for the scientists, it's the most unbelievable resource because they support academia as well as industry and international scientists. So anyway, back to my dad. So we made arrangements to donate his brain. We thought it was complicated. And then we got in touch with the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke and said, can we help you with this? And Dr. Koroshetz put me in touch with the women who run the brain bank, and we got it started. I'll tell you, there were two major benefits that we noticed right away, and I'm so happy to share with families, because the first one is that, and this is going to sound corny, but hang with me, there was a palpable sense of comfort that we all felt in my family, and other people have told me about this as well. Just knowing that there's a really good chance that something positive can come from this horrible loss. You know, maybe another family down the road won't have to suffer watching, you know, their loved one pass, because we'll learn some stuff from this. But the second thing is even more interesting, especially in neurodegenerative cases like the dementias and Parkinson's. As part of being a brain donor family, the brain bank will provide, also at no cost, a copy of a really enlightening report, and that is called a Summary of Neuropathological Findings. That told us, and it tells anybody, here's the diseases that were found in your loved one's brain. Here's the stage of the disease, the regions of the brain that were impacted. So, you know, in many cases, that's the only definitive diagnosis you'll get. So now, when we learn more about some of these neurodegenerative diseases, that'll be valuable to the rest of us, his children and family, to know how inheritable that is.
Very interesting. Bill, I have to ask this question because we are in an age of very sophisticated technology to look at the brain. We have MRIs, CT scans. How much usage does an actual tissue have as opposed to getting a scan of someone's brain?
Well, it's important to be able to understand those images that we get from MRI and CT in the context of what's going on in the actual tissue of the brain. So we can see patterns on those images, and we need to compare them to the pathology that exists in those same individuals so that we can understand what those images truly mean. Also, there's no substitute for looking at a protein inside a cell, inside a tissue, to understand why biologically something might be occurring. So in my own work as a genetic epidemiologist, one of the questions we often struggle to answer is, why is there a particular variant that's associated with a disease responsible for the symptoms of the disease? What's going on biologically? Because you don't necessarily know from just knowing what the change in the DNA is. But if we can then go in to brain tissue from people that carry that same variant who had the disease and look at what was going on with the proteins inside the cells, did the structure of the brain change? Were certain cells more likely to die than others? Whereas there neuropathology associated with that variant that's not present otherwise? That is something that you can really still best see by looking at brain tissue, and not always does it show up on imaging. And in fact, it's by looking at some of the brain tissue, we can then map it back to images so that we can then, in other people, look at images and interpret it in the context of what we know from brain pathology. And so it helps us use those images in clinical settings and otherwise over time. So the gifts people give of their brains help us help other people, even if we can't see their brains.
That's really interesting. Let's go out to the audience for our first question. Margaret has a question about what families might learn after a loved one's brain is donated. Hi, Margaret.
Hello.
Hey there, go ahead.
Yes, my dad, I had found out about the Brain Donor Project, and I'm signed up already, but my dad passed away last summer, and an initial report, as Tish was talking about, with kind of like that initial diagnosis. But will we specifically hear how dad's brain is used in research, or just, I mean, obviously it's enough to know that we're helping, but will we ever find out more details?
Unfortunately not. It's very difficult because so many parts of so many brains are used for so many things. So please rest assured that it's very valuable and very, very helpful, but the specifics are something that they don't share.
But you do hear from a lot of us different advances that took place because of the brain donations that we received. So we communicate routinely with our families and donors to explain, here are the research projects that happened over the past year. And so while you won't know specifically that your loved one's brain was included in a project, you will see the types of projects that are supported. And we think that that's at least partially one way to give back to the people that gave us so much.
Monica has a question about how to talk with her family about brain donation. Welcome, Monica, to Science Friday.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, if I have a family member, she has a neurological condition and has been asked to donate her brain to the brain bank at Northwestern University in Chicago. She's game to do it, and I want to support her in that. But what are the sort of questions or concerns from family or friends that I can anticipate, and how should I respond to those in order to support this idea?
That's a good question. A lot of people are concerned that it'll interfere somehow with funeral plans or slow down that process. And it doesn't, since the brain needs to be removed and hopefully stored safely back at the brain bank well within 18 to 24 hours. It doesn't get in the way of anything else that might be going on. And one of the things, I think people used to be a little, I'll use the scientific word, hinkier about brain donation and what happens to our parts after we die than they are now. My experience has been, once people have a good understanding of how critical the need is for this tissue, of how we're not going to get to the next set of breakthroughs without it, or at least not fast enough, then a lot of the objections they might have seem to just fall away. When they know they're doing something important as heck to advance science. My experience has been that so many people are like, hey, if it can help somebody on my way out the door, I'm fine, I'm finished.
Well, Tish just mentioned how fast you have to get the brain, right? After the person has died. How fast is that?
So the answer to how fast do we want the brain, it's as quickly as we can get it. But the reality is that the first 24 hours after death are the most important. And so our goal in the Neurobiobank and at the Brain Endowment Bank is to complete the process of donation within 24 hours. However, that's not always possible, and sometimes it will get a little bit longer. And there are some brain banks that have flexibility on that interval, but usually it's the first day, sometimes extending into the next day, that is most critical. There are some brain banks that will only recover tissue that they can bring in within the first 6 to 8 hours because they're really prioritizing speed. We tend to be a little bit more deliberative in some cases because we're bringing in donations from all over the country, and so transportation time sometimes matters. But yeah,
Now I understand.
24 hours
I'm sorry.
is the
Yeah.
short answer.
Okay. Now I understand that you've been leading long-term research studying patients with Parkinson's. So explain to me how using a brain bank's data helps you understand about Parkinson's.
So when I got started a long time ago with brain donation as part of our longitudinal study of people with Parkinson's disease. And it was a genetic study where we wanted to understand why certain people with particular changes in their DNA develop Parkinson's. And we wanted to see whether it led to different changes in the brain. So one of the first things that we were interested in is looking at the particular part of the brain, the substantia nigra, which is the part of the brain that goes away fastest, if you want to think of it that way, in people with Parkinson's disease. And it creates dopamine that helps you with movement and some of the signs that are well associated with Parkinson's. And we wanted to see whether there were recognizable changes. And what we found is that there are some changes in DNA that happen after we are born. So they're called epigenetic changes that might be different in people with Parkinson's disease in these parts of the brain. And so that led us to hypothesize different ways that we might explore the biology of Parkinson's disease that we weren't considering before. Another thing that we're doing now is we're part of a project in the Brain Endowment Bank that Tish was referring to earlier, where we're trying to look at things on the cellular level and create maps or atlases of the brain so that we can use them for comparisons. And one of the projects that we're involved with is looking at single cells in several regions of people with Parkinson's disease to see whether the changes are uniform across those regions at the individual cell level, whether genes are expressed at different levels from region to region and from person to person, depending on how far along their disease symptoms were at the time they died. And so that is the kind of very detailed examination that you can get from brain tissue that you can't necessarily get from other types of samples.
Cheryl is next up, and she has a question about brain donation and COVID-19. Oh, this should be very interesting. Hi, Cheryl. Welcome to Science Friday.
Hi. I was just curious about whether or not people have been donating brains that when they died of COVID.
So there are some brain banks that are accepting donations from people that have active COVID. Now we're getting to the point where a lot of people have recovered from COVID, and that's part of their medical history, but they're still brain donors and we would still receive their tissues. Early on in the pandemic, most brain banks were not doing anything. Actually, we weren't in the lab, we weren't recovering brains donated by anyone. And then over time, some brain banks were able to create facilities where it was safe to recover brain tissue from donors that had active COVID at the time that they died, and others can't. So that's a brain bank specific thing, but there are some that where that is possible.
Some of the most cutting edge neuroscience research is a project that is cataloging, if I understand it, every neuron in the brain as part of NIH's Brain Initiative. How are researchers using data from brain banks to do this?
So
Sounds like an incredibly complicated and detailed project.
the Brain Initiative is touching all parts of NIH research, and the Neurobiobank is a partner in the Brain Initiative. And we are participating in a project that is starting this year that is creating a brain cell atlas for use in Brain Initiative projects. And our mission as the Brain Bank coordinators is to identify enough people who fit that criteria we talked about before of neurotypical controls or unaffected comparison individuals from across the age span and from all different kinds of racial, ethnic, and demographic groups. And that collection will be the basis of this atlas. So we want it to be as representative as possible of as many people as possible. And it is if it fulfills its promise, it will give us a very, very detailed roadmap to every structure, every cell type, every part of the brain. And it would be an incredibly important resource for decades.
Let's go to Peggy. Peggy has a question about what researchers have learned about the brain through brain donations. Hi, Peggy. Welcome to Science Friday.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can go right ahead.
I'm not very experienced with Zoom, but I have something to share and something to ask. I've lived with schizophrenia most of my life. And in 2002, I joined ongoing research in schizophrenia at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And several years ago, the NIMH followed up with a detailed interview. And I recently made a personal decision to donate my brain to research. And I believe research is going to end the suffering caused by mental illnesses. And this is what I'd like to know. How close is research coming to understanding the causes of mental illnesses, and how does brain donation factor in?
Well, I can tell you part of that real quick is the National Institute for Mental Health is one of the major funders of the Neurobiobank, and Dr. Gordon is unbelievably committed to solving the problem of severe mental illnesses, because it is just devastating for families. Bill may know more about specific studies that have worked on that. I know there have been dozens in the last couple of years, and mental health has been a huge initiative.
Well, I'll highlight a couple of mental health studies that I think are very important to advancing answers in this area. The NIH funds a group of studies under the Common Mind Initiative, which grew out of the genetic studies of a couple of decades ago. And it is a project that is putting together brain resources and other data to allow us to better understand psychiatric and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Another major initiative that we haven't talked about very much here, but we're a part of here in Miami, is a brain bank at the Veterans Administration focused on post-traumatic stress disorder. And what that brain bank would really like to do is to understand in people with service-related PTSD how their brains are affected. And we need donors with those histories to participate in that initiative as well. So a short way of putting it is, if you have an interest, there is likely a brain bank that is also interested in that same thing. And it's just a matter of finding the right place for you to donate.
Can you specify what kind of research you'd like your brain to be involved in? Define the disease or the illness?
So what I usually tell families is two things. First of all, they do a whole lot of assessments on the brain once it is received, and then it is classified or characterized as the brain of an X-year-old man or female with, let's say, Parkinson's, for example. And then so when researchers are working on Parkinson's disease and they say, oh, I need the brain of a blah, 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 with Parkinson's disease, that particular brain is made available for that. So it's pretty obvious how that works as what someone who's diagnosed. However, the reason we tell people they really can't specify is they could develop something else, or the researchers could find something else when they do the postmortem analysis. So that decision's really left best in the hands of the people who are doing the research. There are also sometimes people who have control tissue at the moment and they want to support a certain disease. And we tell them that the reason that scientists don't permit that is that wouldn't be operating as a very good steward of this precious tissue, since controls can be used for so many different kinds of study. A single control brain can be used in dozens and dozens of studies. So yeah, we don't.
Good
really
answer.
do
That's a very well thought out answer. Rebecca has a question about whether her brain might be useful for researchers. Rebecca, hi, welcome.
Hello. I was wondering, my whole life I have suffered with depression and social anxiety. That's been kind of a standard throughout my family. I became a soldier and went to Iraq, and I'm pretty positive I have blast damage from my time there, possibly CTE. So my question is, since I have two major crossover things there, would my brain still be of use, or is it now like an outlier, you know?
No, it's very useful. I don't think there's anybody who only has one thing. In fact, we sometimes say, is there really such a thing as control anymore? We've all got stuff and we're not in silos. So no, I think your brain would be very valuable. You've been through a lot. Thank you for asking.
What about athletes and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, as you mentioned, CTE? Are you finding people donating brains, and are they becoming useful for that kind of research?
So there are a couple of different places where people with CTE or suspicion that they have CTE have been donating brains. There is a well-established CTE brain bank in Boston. There are CTE donors within the Neurobiobank as well, and just not as many of them. And then they often are participating in more local brain bank initiatives as part of their local universities or their local institutions. And so there are multiple places where those donors are being registered and where they're making contributions.
Wow, this has certainly been really, really, really interesting. Yes, Tish, you want to have a final word?
I was just going to say, actually, there's a lot of men and women who are pre-registered with multiple concussions and TBI, wondering if they have CTE. Big problem, not only with that athletes, but domestic violence. There's so many women, and a lot of scientists believe that TBI and multiple concussions manifest very differently in men and women. So we need a lot of more research on that.
I think that's a really good, an important point that I want to emphasize from what Tish said. Some of these things we're talking about, we only know about after we look at the brain. So when somebody registers, they don't necessarily register because they say, I have CTE. They register because they've had concussions or they've had a TBI or they have symptoms that are consistent with it, but they don't know. And so just because you don't know for sure doesn't mean you can't register to be a donor. You describe what your exposures have been, what your history is, and the brain bank can then use that to describe the brain when people request it for research.
Well, this has certainly been an enlightening discussion for me. And I'm hoping that we've helped our listeners who want to donate their brains after their death. Hopefully that we've helped them out and we've helped both of you out. And I want to thank you both for taking time to be with us today. Dr. Bill Scott, Executive Director of the University of Miami's Brain Endowment Bank based in Miami, and Tish Hevel, CEO of the Brain Donor Project based in Naples, Florida. Thank you both for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if our audience, if you want to learn more about brain donation or you want to pre-register your brain, we've got a website for you, our website, sciencefriday.com/brain donation. sciencefriday.com/brain donation. We have to take a quick break. And when we come back, did meat really make us human? We'll be talking with a scientist who's challenging a long-held belief about human evolution. Stay with us. This is Science Friday from WNYC Studios.